Therapy is very personal, which is why making this video on the lessons I learned in therapy this year feels very scary and vulnerable. But as a therapist myself, something I've come to learn is just a fact of life is that no matter what the issue is that someone's going through, no matter what it is that's causing them to feel stressed or depressed or anxious, whether it's a work thing or a relationship thing or a family thing, when you distill down all of these issues, they share more or less the same root issue. And the same lessons can be applied to pretty much any of these issues to make them better. So I hope that by sharing the lessons that I learned this year in therapy, that you can use them to have a happier, more peaceful, more intentional year ahead. The first thing I learned is that our bodies are only able to handle one unhealthy situation at a time. So we can either be in a job that's really bad for us, or a relationship that's really bad for us, or a living situation that's really bad for us. But our bodies don't physically have the capacity to handle more than one of these unhealthy situations at a time. If we find ourselves in two or more of these unhealthy situations at a time, that's when we can start having difficulty getting out of bed, being so overwhelmed that we just completely freeze and do nothing. And that's actually our body's way of telling us, I don't want any part of this. And that can actually lead to the second thing that I learned in therapy this year, which is that your unhappiness can actually be a good thing. When my therapist first said this to me, I was like, what? How does that, unhappiness feels bad. So how can it possibly be good? And her response was that unhappiness is a signal that something in our life is off and that something needs to change. And because unhappiness feels bad, that actually makes unhappiness motivating because, well, we don't want to feel bad. We want to get out of that state. So in that way, unhappiness can be a good thing because it can be a catalyst for us to take action to make a change for the better. Now, the third lesson is where it gets kind of tricky, and that is that when we're not doing so well mental health wise, so if we're feeling depressed or anxious, the decisions that we make in that state are usually shit. We say yes when we mean no, we say no when we mean yes, we do things that we shouldn't do, and we don't do things that we should do. And that is because the decision-making part of our brain literally becomes impaired when we are in a depressed or anxious state. So when I first learned this, I was thinking, if unhappiness is also a signal that we need to make a decision to change something, but our unhappiness is also the thing that's impairing our ability to make that decision, then what are we supposed to do about that? How do we reconcile that? So the answer to that seemingly impossible question is that when you find yourself in a depressed or anxious state, the best thing that you can do is stop. Don't make any sudden moves. Don't make any big decisions. Don't start or end any jobs or relationships or anything like that. Remove yourself from the situations that you suspect are contributing to you feeling that way so that you can take some space from them. And that'll help you to evaluate them more accurately of whether or not you should change something about them. And when you're taking this space, this is when talking to a therapist or someone you trust who knows you really well can be so valuable, because when we're not doing well mental health wise, sometimes we can't even trust ourselves. So by talking to someone that we do trust and who has our best interest at heart, that can help us to be 1,000% sure that we are making the best decision for us. Okay, so the rest of the lessons are specifically about relationships, because our relationships are actually the thing that has the biggest impact on our mood and our overall well-being. So it comes up a lot in therapy. So the first thing that I learned is about setting boundaries, especially as someone who setting boundaries just does not come naturally to me. And that is that I'm editing this video now and I realized that I said it backwards in the original clip, so I'm just gonna re-record it here. So when it comes to choosing to set a boundary with someone, it's a matter of choosing between feeling guilty if you do set it and feeling resentful if you don't set it. And between these two choices, the better choice is always to feel guilty. Speaking of boundaries, the next thing that I learned is that feeling of anger that you get when someone mistreats you or disrespects you, or maybe even explicitly harms you, is actually a good thing. Let me explain. So that anger is actually a signal that a boundary so critical to you was violated in that moment. And carrying a little bit of that anger with you will actually protect you from ever allowing that boundary to be crossed ever again. And in fact, it'd actually be more concerning if you lost that anger, because that would mean that you would have to start all over in therapy again, learning to set boundaries and having the self-respect to set boundaries. So we actually should be carrying around a little bit of that anger with us for life, because it's protective and it keeps us sharp. We're gonna keep going with this whole boundaries thing. So the next thing I learned is that there should be no difference between what you tolerate in a friendship and what you tolerate in a romantic relationship. It's not uncommon for people to continue the relationship with their romantic partner even after their partner has done something so regrettable or just generally treated them poorly, that if a friend had done that same thing, they would not be friends with them anymore. Like, it would not even be a question. And this should not be the way that we exist in romantic relationships. Like, yes, there should be a level of tolerance in romantic relationships, but romantic relationships shouldn't be just about tolerance. Like, we're just being hurtful to ourselves at that point. So if something happens, or there's a conflict, or your romantic partner does something that's deeply upsetting to you and you're trying to figure out what to do from there, a good question to ask yourself is, if a friend had done this same thing, would I still continue being friends with them? And I'm just gonna throw a bonus lesson in there in case anybody needs to hear this, but if you wouldn't even be friends with someone, you definitely should not date them. The next thing I learned is that there are 3 parts to any relationship: how you feel about that person, how that person makes you feel, and how it feels to be in that relationship. Now, all these 3 things kind of sound like they're all the same thing, so let me try to differentiate them a little bit. So, how you feel about that person is simply, do you like them or do you not like them? Do you think they're a good person? Do you think they have good qualities? Or maybe do you think they're just like a meh person, or maybe do you think they're not a very good person? Now, how does that person make you feel? Do they make you feel happy, excited, calm, or do they make you feel anxious, annoyed, bored? And finally, how does it feel to be in that relationship? Do you feel safe, secure, respected, supported, loved? Or do you feel unsafe, insecure, unsupported, unloved, lonely? So for a relationship to be a healthy one, we need to be feeling good and positive in all of these 3 areas. It's not enough to only be feeling positive in 1 or 2 of these areas. So it's not enough that we really like someone and think they're a good person, but we feel anxious and insecure around them. Or it's also not enough that we feel loved and supported in the relationship, but we only think that person is a meh person and we feel annoyed around them. Like, we need to be feeling positive in all these 3 areas in order for the relationship to be a viable one. And finally, the last lesson I learned in therapy this year is that action breaks rumination. Rumination is not only something that we do when we're feeling depressed or anxious, it's also something that makes us feel even more depressed or anxious. So it just turns into this downward negative spiral, and it's just not a good time. And oftentimes the reason why we are ruminating is because all we have to go off of is old information of our past mistakes or regrets or things gone wrong. So if that's the case, then the way that we can break this rumination cycle is to do something. Take some sort of action to create new experiences. And when we create new experiences, that gives us new information that could potentially prove the old information wrong and break that rumination cycle. So that's what I learned in therapy this year. I hope this video could be valuable to you in some way and that you can use some of these lessons as we go into the new year to make this year a good one. As always, I hope you're staying well. Happy New Year, and I will see you next time. Bye.